This is a unique opportunity. Gabe Brown and Dr. Grandin on one conversation. And actually, what we get is some interesting back and forth between Gabe and Dr. Grandin.
So don't you think getting more visual thinkers would be a benefit in agriculture and in all facets of society?
Absolutely. Absolutely, they'd be a benefit in agriculture. And we need to be getting kids growing plants and things at a really young age. That's stuff that we need to be doing. I mean, the elementary school kids need to be growing plants and having a garden. And, this is the kind of stuff that the kids are not doing. And the thing is when with AI now, and let's take my kind of mind, anything to do with fixing mechanical things, those jobs aren't going away. A lot of entry-level computer programming jobs are going away. They're not hiring very much right now.
What can the listeners to this podcast do to encourage more visual thinkers?
Well, get them in, start a gardening project to get the local kids involved in it. I mean, that's where it starts. Growing stuff is cool. Let's teach young children that that's a fun thing to do.
We're also going to talk about their perspective on integrating livestock and the importance of that, and regenerative agriculture as a whole.
Regenerative farmers and ranchers inevitably will become least cost producers because their input costs are so much less. And I really believe as more and more enter the regenerative space, the prices for regenerative products is bound to come down some. Now, there's another side of that coin that I really think we need to look at, and that is the nutrient density. And take a look at what many households feed their children for breakfast. It's some sugar-laden breakfast cereal. But you look at the cost of that per ounce, and then you look at the cost of a pasture-raised egg, the cost of some pastured bacon. You know what? You can feed the children that nutrient-dense pastured egg and pastured bacon as cheap as you can feed them that sugar-laden cereal.
All that and more on this episode of the Working Cows Podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast. Very excited to be joined today by Richard and Claire. Richard is the host of the 6 Inches of Soil podcast, and he has been generous enough, and Claire, along with him, is the producer. They've been generous enough to share with me an episode that they recently recorded with Gabe Brown and Dr. Grandin, and just a really unique opportunity to get their perspective. And so I just wanted to welcome them to the podcast and give them an opportunity to share a little bit about what they've been doing, the work that they've been doing, and just let you know, hey, here's another regenerative agriculture podcast out there. Go and check them out. There'll be links in the show notes page for today where you can find the 6 Inches of Soil podcast, and just encourage you to do that. So Richard, Claire, welcome to the Working Cows Podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Clay. Thanks for having us and for allowing us to take over your podcast feed for one episode. I've been in the meat world for about 25 years in the processing space. So I actually listen to your podcast a lot to get the farming perspective. But I've lived in the area of slaughterhouse, processing, retail world. And really that's what our podcast is about, is trying to get multiple voices to work out all of the connections from soil all the way through to products on shelf. So that's a little bit about myself. And Claire, what's the background behind 6 Inches of Soil?
Yeah, hi, Clay. Thanks so much for having us. So we started the journey 5 years ago as a bunch of filmmakers and campaigners in this space, and really, really passionate about soil, health of it, and the nurturing of it through regenerative farming. So we created, first of all, a documentary, and that's gone on to lead us to produce further shorts, which we're cutting at the moment. And then this podcast came about, and Richard was one of our advisors when it came to navigating the meat question and beef, etc. So we're now working together, which is really exciting.
I was going to say, the reason that we wanted to bring this episode particularly to your listeners, Clay, is that I've been working for a while on trying to get Temple Grandin, who's obviously a world leader in terms of animal welfare and the impact that she has had on our meat industry collectively as a globe. And from downstream, from the meat world, a lot of people, a lot of buyers know who Temple Grandin is, and they understand the importance of animal welfare and that link with her. But what was exciting about this episode is the ability to get the world leader in animal welfare together with the world leader of regenerative agriculture. And Gabe's obviously been that for many years and has helped shape the mission that you're on. So I'm really excited to share that with your listenership.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's great to see those two things come together. And, I think it's one of those things that often happens in the world where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so when we match animal welfare, low stress stockmanship and some of those things with regenerative agriculture, the outcome is greater than either one of them by itself for the end consumer, for the product that the end consumer is able to enjoy. Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I would encourage listeners to go watch the movie called Temple Grandin. Claire Danes does an amazing job at portraying her life and all the things that she's achieved. But yeah, it's all connected, right? And I think probably the listeners to your podcast are very aware of what the word regenerative means in terms of agriculture and meat production, growing animals, crops, etc. But once you start to move out of that world and get into the supermarket space, I think there's still a lot of education to be done to understand what the word means, what it stands for, how it's all interlinked. So the more we can do to bring all of these different worlds together from a perception point of view, I think it's really important if we're going to achieve our goal of scaling this so that it just becomes food production rather than, specialty food production or regenerative food production. This just becomes the way we produce food.
Very good. Very good. Well, anything else to say before we send people off to the conversation that you facilitated between Dr. Grandin and Gabe?
Well, I would just encourage your listeners to check out our podcast. It's called 6 Inches of Soil, and we do get multiple guests on each episode. And I've had the privilege of being exposed to some amazing people through my career. And so that we try to get them all in one place. So hopefully your listenership would enjoy that. And secondly, the documentary, which Claire produced called 6 Inches of Soil, is a wonderful piece of work. And that is available in the US right now. So go check that out too.
Very good.
Yeah, and just like to add, if you are listening, you do get to hear from global guests, but mostly we have guests from the States and Britain on together. So you have like a roundtable discussion. And that's what we're trying to bring to people. So yeah, but it's lovely to be featured also sharing this space with working cows. So thank you.
So yeah, very good. Really appreciate this opportunity. And we will share this conversation with you right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Are rising input costs keeping you up at night? At Understanding Ag, they help producers like you save money and build resilience through regenerative agriculture. Their team of experienced farmers and ranchers will show you how to reduce reliance on costly fertilizers, pesticides, and feed by working with nature, not against it. With proven regenerative practices, you can improve soil health, boost water retention, and increase your land's productivity while cutting expenses. From grazing plans to cover cropping to full system redesigns, they tailor solutions to your land and your goals. Let them help you make the transition from input-intensive, conventional, to profit-enhancing regenerative agriculture. Visit understandingag.com and take the first step toward a more profitable and sustainable future.
Good. Your bolo tie is looking fantastic.
I just wanted to make sure it was on straight.
Well, first of all, it's really lovely to meet you. It's an honor for us to have you join us on this conversation. And I was actually curious, have you met Gabe before?
Yeah, I have. I've met a lot of people in a lot of different places. I don't always remember.
Yeah. So Temple and I met at a conference. I was, of course, very familiar with her work. And we met at a conference, had a very nice conversation, had my picture taken with her. And I have to say, even before that conference, I was very flattered when the editor of my book had reached out to me saying that Temple had gotten a preview copy of my book and she read it on a flight, and she reached out to the editor saying she'd like to endorse that book and write a blurb for it. So there's actually an endorsement from Temple in my book, which I'm very honored and flattered to have. So thank you for that, Temple.
No, and I'm a big fan of more regenerative farming methods. Now, we've got to be getting the plants and the animals back together again. Way too much monoculture. Like, for example, last year, 5 years ago, 40% of our corn, our maize went into ethanol. Now it's 45%. You got monocultures of corn. No cattle are grazing the stalks. I think that's just terrible. We'll leave out where I saw this. We'll leave that out. But I saw that just this real early spring. I was not happy about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's a big part of the reason our soils are degrading is we've removed animals from the land.
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem. I've been in this industry for 50 years, and I'm sick and tired of cattle being bashed as environment wreckers. And people forget that 20% or more of our land, like eastern Colorado, for example, can only be grazed. You can't crop that land. There's not enough water in the ground or coming out of the sky. It's that simple. You've got other areas like Sandhills in Nebraska, and the Flint Hills in Kansas, big parts of Arizona. The only way you can get food off this land is to graze it. There's no other way. And so I wrote a paper on rotational grazing about 3 years ago called Grazing Cattle, Sheep, and Goats is an Important Part of a Sustainable Agricultural Future. Just going over some of the research. And yes, cattle put out methane, but so do dumps and a lot of other things.
That's right. That's right. And we have to remember that the rich, deep topsoils around the world were formed with that harmony of a diverse array of plants plus grazing herbivores.
That's right. No, that's absolutely right. And you see, the problem you got with monoculture is in the short run, it works great. In the short run, it works great. And in the long run, you're going to be in a pile of trouble. Yeah, you see, that's the thing. That's the problem. And the thing I have found all the years I've been around, I don't care what industry you're in, little guys innovate. The little people innovate. And let me just tell you one example. I can remember 15 years ago or so, the poultry industry stuck their nose up at probiotics. Isn't that stupid? Probiotics. That's just nonsense. Well, just before COVID hit, I went to the great big show they used to call the poultry show. It was a huge food show. And there were banners hanging down over the entrance to the trade show advertising probiotics. Yeah, that is at probiotics for poultry. That's just one example where something that was considered far out is now totally mainstream. And it was little people that started that innovation. I don't care whether it's, ChatGPT started out as a little guy. This is true for just about anything. These chips that NVIDIA sells, they're called graphic processor units. They were originally made for video games. They're not being used for video games anymore now.
Yeah, totally interesting how things kind of progress. And Temple, speaking of progression, I'm really curious to explore the fact that in terms of being front of mind and the reason why consumers choose certain cuts of meat or certain types of meat, back in the 80s when you started, probably animal welfare definitely wasn't on the radar of most consumers. And now, over half of meat sold in global supermarkets has some kind of animal welfare claim, cage-free, certified humane, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's just look at slaughter. That's the thing I've had the most experience with. When I started out in the 70s, I've been now in the industry over 50 years, these slaughter plants actually were fairly decent. Then in the 80s, they went through a gigantic expansion phase. I'm going to call that the sloppy phase. It was really, really, really bad. It was totally, totally bad. And then the early 90s were really bad. And then there was some policy changing events. In the early 90s, there was the Jack-in-the-Box food poisoning, E. coli, and that caused food safety to get really cleaned up. And one of the pioneers in that was McDonald's, of all things. They just went through the industry, just went after them. And then McDonald's hired me back in 1997 to start looking at animal welfare. And it was interesting taking the high-level executives out on their first tours of slaughter plants and seeing undercover boss moments. That show Undercover Boss. The boss is really shocked at some of the stuff he sees. And I'll never forget the day that Bob Langer from McDonald's saw a half-dead dairy cow go into their product. He said, yeah, there are some things we're really going to have to change. And I had developed a very simple scoring system for scoring slaughter plants on animal welfare. 5 things you score. When you hang it up, it better be dead. You better be able to shoot 95% of the cattle on the first shot. Have no more than 3 out of 100 bellowing in the stunning box area. No more than 1% falling down. And you better get 75% of a move with no electric prod and no acts of abuse. Very, very simple. They knew exactly what they had to do for their numbers. And I taught the McDonald's food safety auditors on how to do this. And at first, they were kind of skeptical. They were already out in the plants doing food safety. First, they were kind of skeptical, but then when they saw the good it was happening, some of them just grabbed the hold of it. And then Wendy's and Burger King came on a few months later. So all 3 of these companies were now enforcing some animal welfare standards. And I get asked what I'm the most proud of. I got lots of equipment out there. I had a lot of equipment out there. People tore it up and wrecked it. Now they were forced to manage the stuff. And out of 74 very large beef and pork plants, only 3 had to buy expensive remodels. Everything else we fixed with non-slip flooring, repairs, training, and 3 plant managers were removed. And this is one of the things I'm the most proud of. I saw more change in 1999 than I'd seen in my whole career prior to that. It was very disheartening putting in nice facilities, watching people wreck them, and do bad things to cattle in it or pigs. That was very difficult to deal with. But it basically forced them to manage the plants. That's what it did. And, one of the reasons the industry didn't go fight against it was, they'd been through the whole mess with the Jack-in-the-Box E. coli thing. And I wasn't asking them to do crazy things. I had expensive equipment to sell. I did reverse conflict of interest. I bent over backwards not to sell it. How could I fix that place with some non-slip flooring? I have no conflict of interest with that. With just repairs, with some lights. I've put up a solid sign in a strategic location so they don't see the truck outside. Just simple stuff. And most of the places we were able to fix, we made some shabby old places work. I'm not going to say I'm going to copy those designs, but we were able to make those factories work. Slaughterhouses, another thing is they're basically just handling systems. And so it's a lot easier to fix than farms. The problem we get with farms is slaughterhouses are more or less the same around the world, but farms are not. You have very different situations. And to put in the kind of housing you might want to have, that does cost money. Where basically improving handling costs 3 plant managers their jobs. But what training and a whole lot of little changes does makes a difference. It makes a really big.
Do you think it was important to tie the profitability to what you were doing? I mean, there's a scene in the documentary, in your documentary movie, where you say the phrase, or at least in the film, you say, "What's good for cattle is good for business." And I was curious, do you think that was critical in getting them to adopt your methodology?
Selling equipment, that's how I sold equipment. Take out a person, workman's comp. Those were reduce bruises. Yeah, those were ways things I did to sell equipment. But what pushed what made all the change take place from the handling is I had all three of the biggest burger companies doing the same thing. And there's an awful lot of business money they'd lose if they got kicked off the McDonald's approved supplier list.
Gabe, you often talk about this link between profitability and regenerative agriculture. How do you help shift the perception of regenerative agriculture from being this kind of niche idea to something scalable, practical, and central to a resilient food system?
As I and members of the team go around and educate farmers, they have to take a real interest. And what means more than just about anything else to the farmers, obviously, besides their own health and the health of their family, is profitability. So that's where it needs to start. So where we always start is when we go out and consult on a farm is where's the low-hanging fruit? And what we mean by that is where can we garner the farmer, the rancher, more profit for the least amount of input, whether it be in labor and dollars spent on inputs. And what you do is you show them increased profitability. Start with that low-hanging fruit always, because once a farmer or rancher sees higher profitability, they're going to go, oh, I want some more of that. So that's where we always start.
Kind of a bit like Temple's example of instead of changing a whole meat plant, realizing that it's just a flag in the wrong position and move that flag at a tiny cost, suddenly things work better and they're more profitable.
And, we often see that, speaking on my own ranch, I can walk by, I see something every day and I don't really notice. If I made a little change there, may increase my profitability. But if you get a new set of eyes there and they say, hey, why don't you try this here? And it can increase profitability significantly for least amount of cost. Yes, by all means, do that.
Problems we've got now. I was just reading an article yesterday, one of our business magazines, about Generation Z. The kids that are in college now, the young kids, half of them are renting. They can't buy a house. It's taking up a third of their income. They're very worried about money. This is like right off the labor stuff. And I've gone to the supermarket. We had $9 and $10 eggs recently due to avian influenza. I actually took a picture of expensive eggs. We've had a drought and our cow herd is way down. The price of beef was $10 for a little tiny package of hamburger. And the pork and the chicken was way much cheaper. Yes, the factory farmed, was way cheaper. You're faced with that meat case and that egg case, and you're working on $15 an hour job. I've got certain jobs that kind of use my index jobs. Airplane fueler. I looked up that job. $15 an hour. They get benefits. Which chicken are they going to buy? They'll buy the cheapest eggs that are in that egg case because they have to. And this is, the egg prices have gone a little bit more reasonable. The beef prices right now are just horrible. I was just the other day, I was in the grocery store looking at that and going, ugh.
Dr. Grandin, how do we balance the realities of the modern agriculture, the confinement type operations, some of which degrade the resources? You talked earlier about monoculture corn and.
Well, it depends on how you do it. It depends how you do it. We have got to have a decent large-scale commercial. That's my new term for, I'm not going to call factory farms. We've got to have a decent large-scale commercial. And there's things that we can do to make it a lot better. I have to declare my conflict of interest. I do work for Costco. They pay me very well. They pay me 2 graduate students worth of money. McDonald's pays me 1 graduate student worth of money. And I take that money and the book money, and I've been putting students through graduate school. I put 24 students through graduate school with this money, paid their fees. I have 3 professors now that are out in 3 different universities. One of them, Lily, she works here, that I paid for their PhD education, not their undergrad, but their PhD education. So I made that declaration. But there's some things that you can do better. One thing that Costco did, and they did something where the whole industry laughed at them. And there's a guy named Luke, young veterinarian. He says, let's take our fancy super growth bird and we're going to breed it to an old-fashioned male. It's called the Hubbard male. Hubbard male has gigantic legs. So now you put gigantic legs on the fancy, high-powered chicken, and you get a much stronger bird. It still grows fast. You take some meat off the breast, put it on the legs. I think giant drums are going to be the new tailgate food. But you actually made a chicken that was a lot better. Because the other problem we got with the chicken thing is if I go to the totally old-fashioned birds, how about 15%, 20% more feed? This is the problem. And so what Costco did was we'll still have a high-performance chicken, but they redistributed the meat. And you know what? The whole industry is going to copy it. Because one guy, and I've got a really cute picture of him laying in the chicken house, all the chickens around him, decided to do that, and people thought it was stupid. Yeah. Okay. And then Costco's chicken compared to the other big companies is a small company compared to the one guy did that. Try one house, you liked it, one breeder house, then you try a couple of breeder houses, you roll it out gradually. But we're going to have to do things like this. Because I think what I see happening, and it's going to be like our beer industry right here in Fort Collins. We have a gigantic Budweiser plant. And in the shadow of the Budweiser plant are all these little craft breweries that coexist. Now, one of the advantages of having those small guys is when you have an emergency like COVID, which shut down some of the big companies, you still have some supply in the little companies. The problem with big, it's fragile. And when it breaks, it is a mess when it breaks. Big is fragile. It's not. And I think looking at the whole food thing, we're going to have a decent large-scale commercial. But then large-scale commercial learns from the little guy. 20 years ago, they laughed at probiotics for chickens. They laughed at it. Now they hang banners all over the trade show about it.
But to your point, yeah, big isn't always better, but also sometimes small isn't always better. I mean, I think of all of the farmers around the US and the UK, and they have to decide, are they going to send their livestock to small local slaughter plants or some of the bigger nationals? And that the smaller ones aren't necessarily.
We have a huge need for more decent small slaughter plants. And there's been some new plants that have been constructed. Actually, the government puts money into it, like right around COVID time. They put some money into that. The thing about a more diversified supply chain, it costs more, but it doesn't break as easily. Big is very efficient, but it breaks extremely easily. Let's say you have something happen to the electrical grid. You could run the small plants on a generator. There's no way you run the big ones on generators. No way.
Yeah. And it goes back to, Gabe, your thing of diversity. Like, that's what we need in life and slaughter plants on the farm, right? And I guess thinking of diversity and big systems, feedlots versus grass-fed, grass-finished. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
What the problem I have with grass-fed, because I'm old enough to, I just turned 78. When I was a child, this was just when the feed yards were forming. Because one of the problems you got with grass-fed is seasonality. You go down to New Zealand, and the plants are closed 4 months out of the year. And the grain feeding started because we had surplus of grain, and then it smooths it out. I'm also very concerned about, we're pushing cattle to be heavier and heavier at a younger age. They're getting heart problems. They're getting foot abnormalities. I have a paper on, the paper's a free download. It's problems with congestive heart failure and lameness have increased in grain-fed steers and heifers. You can find it if you just type in Temple Grandin cattle congestive heart failure. You can find it. And this problem has slowly happened. It used to only happen at real high altitudes. Then about 10 years ago, it started slowly coming down in altitude, and now it's come to a head. Yeah, there are some groups of cattle where 1% of those cattle are going to have to go to salvage slaughter before they're ready, or they're going to just die from heart failure. Yeah, that's terrible.
And what's going to fix that?
There's a big genetic component. But you see, when they started just selecting for heavier at a younger age and big ribeyes, then they started, the heart failure problem got worse. It definitely has a genetic component that showed up very, very clearly in the research. And then we also have problems where cattle just bred to grow fast, having like twisted toes, hoof abnormalities. You have a 4-month-old heifer with a twisted toenail. And most of these problems are in the popular British breeds of cattle, but that's genetic. And there's some groups of cattle where they have a very high percentage with hoof abnormalities. In fact, the Angus Association about 5 years ago came out with a very nice hoof scoring chart. For twisted toes, the slot in the cattle's hoof should be straight, not like that and not like this. They realized they've got to start selecting breeding stock for decent feet. And then got really popular now, beef on dairy. And there's some good things about that. And the good thing with beef on dairy, where you use Angus semen, you breed the dairy cow, and you sect semen, and select for bulls, and then you make steers out of them, and you have a very nice animal that's an Angus Holstein cross. So now the problem of surplus male calves being abused is going to be less because now they're worth something. You see, that's actually good. But there's groups of beef on dairy where their heart problems are just horrendous.
So, in your opinion, what can the industry do to circumvent that?
Well, one of the things is it could be genetic tests. There's a new genetic test that just came out for the heart problems. There is a strong genetic basis. But if you just blindly breed for, large ribeyes, fast carcass weight, and they've got heart failure. And I can remember when this problem was strictly limited to like 10,000 feet, 12,000 feet. But that's no longer the case. We're at 5,000 feet here, and it's showing up in plants that are at 2,000 feet in Kansas and Texas.
Earlier you talked about the need to move somewhat away from just strictly monoculture production and to get more diversity. Do you think that a diversity of diet in feedlot rations would be beneficial to the animal?
Well, it's something that probably needs to be looked at. One thing that would be beneficial would be rotating corn and soy, for example, with a cover crop that you graze. Also, your corn stalks from that corn should be grazed. And one of the things that's preventing it is the fencing laws. In Texas, certain parts of Texas are free range. So if the cattle get out of the corn stalks, it's your problem, period. And so they use a single electric wire to hold them in, which is very economical. But other states, let's say car hits the cattle and injures somebody, sue the farmer, he could lose his farm. And that's one of the reasons why they're not grazing it, because they're so legally liable if the cattle get out, get hit. And I think something needs to be changed on that, because I remember last spring, I was driving by miles and miles of monoculture of corn stalks. Nice looking corn stalks should be grazed. None of it was being grazed. None of it. That was just 2025, like late March.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did.
What about the effect of grain on the nutrient density of the beef? For instance, I'm specifically thinking about the rise in omega-6s, less omega-3s, and
Well, there are some differences, and I know with vegetables, I remember when romaine lettuce was bright green, and then Caesar salads got popular, and it's no longer bright green. But I saw that change. There would be some differences.
Gabe, how do you reconcile making regenerative food truly accessible to all while scaling it so it's both resilient and profitable for farmers whilst being affordable to consumers?
And we have to realize that regenerative farmers and ranchers inevitably will become least cost producers because their input costs are so much less. And I really believe as more and more enter the regenerative space, the prices for regenerative products is bound to come down some. Now, there's another side of that coin that I really think we need to look at, and that is the nutrient density. And take a look at what many households feed their children for breakfast. It's some sugar-laden breakfast cereal, right? But you look at the cost of that per ounce, and then you look at the cost of a pasture-raised egg, the cost of some pastured bacon. You know what? You can feed the children that nutrient-dense pastured egg and pastured bacon as cheap as you can feed them that sugar-laden cereal. And then what's going to happen? If the children eat that nutrient-dense food, they're going to do better in school, they're going to be healthier, etc. So we need to take all costs into consideration. I certainly understand what Temple's saying, but that comes with education also. There's some really good work being done out there that's showing that if we feed children and adults nutrient-dense food, that their healthcare costs decrease significantly. So we have to look at the total costs of things.
And it also highlights in that example the power that you have, you, the listener, as a consumer of food. If you start buying regeneratively produced eggs or foods like that for breakfast instead of the sugar-laden cereals, that signal finds its way back to the big corporations. And that's another way that we can instigate this chain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have to realize that the industrialized, commoditized market, production ag that we have now, came about because of consumer demand. And if consumers start demanding nutrient-dense food that's grown and raised in healthy soils, we're going to be able to change agriculture.
Do you think we need as much beef as we have in the US? Do you think there's too much beef? Is that part of the problem, to try to concentrate on better rather than mass production, big animals? Maybe we should focus on quality.
Most of the cattle originate from, family ranches. And the other big concern is losing family ranches. And I hope they get the death taxes changed, because that's really bad. And I think that's something that may get changed, because we need our family ranchers. If we lose family ranchers, the land's really going to go to heck. Now, one thing that the NCBA does, our National Cattlemen Organization does, is they have a stewardship award, where they recognize ranchers that are doing a good job with the land. There's a very nice program with the Audubon Society on bird conservation, where they are getting together with ranchers. We need to be doing more of these kinds of things, where it's a win-win situation.
Gabe, how do you approach animal genetics, feed diversity, and land stewardship so regenerative beef is both resilient and healthy for herds and ecosystems alike?
That's a very good question, Rich. And I really believe that we have to get back to raising animals that work within our context, wherever our ranch or farm is located. The problem now, the way I see it, is the type of cattle being raised by and large is dictated by the feedlots. As Temple said, they want those very large animals, large ribeyes, because a feedlot is in business to sell feed and yardage. So they want to keep them in there longer, right? Well, those big animals don't work grazing through 2 feet of snow on Gabe Brown's ranch in North Dakota. That's just not going to work. What we saw is when we went down the path of which animals thrive in our environment, and it's going to be different, mine in North Dakota versus someone in North Carolina versus someone in California, etc. What we saw was the size of our cattle decreased dramatically, both in height, but also we saw those animals become much more easier fleshing. They're much deeper bodied animals because they're consuming a lower quality roughage. And then epigenetics kick in. And when epigenetics kick in, those animals thrive better in your environment because they're predisposed to the feeds that you have and the conditions that you have. So I think we need to get back to that. What we'll find is, though, that we will become much more profitable if we allow the animals to select for what works in our environment. And then we'll be able to grass finish those animals easier in our environment.
So do you think there's an opportunity for fewer feedlots in the US and a slight steer towards more grass-fed, grass-finished beef system?
No, I don't think a slight steer. I think a major steer towards grass-fed, grass-finished. I really believe that there's plenty of forage available to grass finish. All the animals that we're feeding in a feedlot, we could grass finish. And people talk about, the seasonality, etc. Yes, in environments such as mine in North Dakota, up in Canada, the northern tier, of course you're not going to be able to grass finish in the winter unless you feed processed forage. But what's wrong with freezing the product? Doesn't say they all have to be harvested and sold as fresh, right?
Yeah. There we go. So, Dr. Grandin, this actually tees up. I've got 2 kids, and I asked them if they had any questions for you, and I recorded my daughter. I'm going to play you that clip, and I want to see what you think about it. So here's the clip.
I'm Sully, and I am 9 years old. I live in Texas, where there are a lot of farms, a lot of barbecue, and not much rain. With all the beef and pork that we are eating, what has been your experience working with farms when the climate is dry and meat production is high?
Lived in Arizona, we were producing a lot of meat out of these feed yards, and we had, being such a hot climate, we had a lot of the Brahman cross cattle. Then they're real heat tolerant. And right now we've had droughts which cut back the cattle numbers a whole lot. That's one of the reasons why there's $10 small packages of hamburger now. The other thing is weather's gotten hotter. When I lived in Phoenix during the 70s. The hottest it ever got for the 10 years I lived there in the 70s was 112. Last summer it got up to 120. It never got that hot when I lived there. Never got that hot. Because I remember reading about Saudi Arabia and thinking, 120. At least it doesn't get that hot here. I mean, that's what I was thinking back in the 70s when I found out they had 120 in Saudi Arabia.
Dr. Grandin, you've been known as a systems thinker, a visual thinker. Could you describe for the listeners what is a visual thinker in your mind?
Well, I describe it in my book, Visual Thinking. You might want to get that. But basically, my memory is like little phone pictures. Things that interest me, my brain takes a snapshot. I don't take a snapshot of everything. Like, let's take hotels, for example. I only really remember really weird and really dirty in terms of the rooms. Now, of course, the different hotel brands, yeah, I know what their lobby looks like. No, that's just kind of, but things that interest me, I make a picture. And then I get all these little pictures on my phone memory, and I can search them using keywords.
So let's run a test then, Dr. Grandin. If I was to say to you 6 inches of soil, what would you be thinking about?
Well, I'm seeing some real black, loamy soil. Seeing that. Then I'm seeing different kinds of soil now. I'm seeing red clay stuff, sandy stuff, sort of going through the soil pictures. Now I'm seeing a dirty shirt I saw on a person the other day. That's soil. Okay, you see, now I tend to get a little off the subject sometimes.
So how can, with regenerative agriculture, and in my book, we describe the what I believe is real lack of observational skills by most farmers.
Well, observational skills are visual thinking. And I'm very concerned that our visual thinkers are getting screened out of our educational system because we're absolutely horrible at higher math. Can't do algebra, can't do calculus. Why does a veterinarian need to have calculus? They don't use calculus. They have to have arithmetic. They've got to know how to dose drugs. And right now I've got a client I'm working with that has a beef plant, a brand new beef plant. We can't say where it is, of course. And they can't get good maintenance people because the people that would be super good at taking care of the equipment, they're playing video games in the basement with an autism diagnosis. And we've taken shop classes out of the schools. Now we're putting them back in some places, putting it back in the community college, but that's almost too late. We need elementary school kids making stuff. I had a student in my class recently. She'd never measured anything with a ruler. She had never used a ruler in her life. Growing up totally separated from the world of the practical. When I was in 11 years old, I took wood shop. I did sewing with a sewing machine that actually sewed in 4th grade. That was 10 years old. We were making all kinds of stuff out of clay and cardboard in 1st grade. Kids are not making enough things. Because I went out on a gigantic construction project where they're building these giant tanks, and they're concerned about where they're going to get the people that have the know-how to put some of this very complicated stuff together. And I told them, we've got to get building things and making things back into elementary school. We've got to start with the really young kids.
You mentioned earlier about your designs of your cattle handling facilities and how many people would change those and they'd actually become much worse.
Oh yeah, we had a problem with that. I've got 2 new plants that started up, and they decided to change the design of the center track restrainer system with some really bad results. So you have to have a false floor. You don't want the cattle to go, this conveyor is 8 feet off the ground. So you put a false floor that you want to have it maybe this far under their feet. But this plant changed it, so it was like that far under their feet. And they saw the visual cliff effect, and it absolutely didn't work. And when it was raised back up, it worked. We got that one fixed. That was fed beef. That got fixed. But we had to go back into 2 places to fix 35-year-old problems. That somebody in the shop decided to just change that, and it just didn't work. That was something I just recently worked on that.
So don't you think getting more visual thinkers would be a benefit in agriculture and in all facets of society?
Absolutely. Absolutely, they'd be a benefit in agriculture. And we need to be getting kids growing plants and things at a really young age. That's stuff that we need to be doing. I mean, the elementary school kids need to be growing plants and having a garden. And, this is the kind of stuff that the kids are not doing. And the thing is when with AI now, let's take my kind of mind, anything to do with fixing mechanical things, those jobs aren't going away. And a lot of entry-level computer programming jobs are going away. They're not hiring very much right now.
what can the listeners to this podcast do to encourage more visual thinkers?
Well, get them start a gardening project to get the local kids involved in it. I mean, that's where it starts. Growing stuff is cool. Let's teach young children that that's a fun thing to do.
Okay, so I've got a little person, a 7-year-old, who wanted to be part of this interview. So I'm going to play a little video which he's made, and I want to see what your answer is to this question.
My name is Oscar and I'm 7 years old. My favorite food is steak. No matter where I go, it's steak time. Is it important to know where my steak comes from and what that farm's practices are?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Yes, it's very important to know how that animal was raised, where it was raised, because that will directly dictate the nutrient density of that steak. So if that animal was raised on healthy soil and had access to a wide array of different plants, the omega-3 content, the CLAs, and all of these beneficial nutrients will be much higher. Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, and obviously that nutrient density will affect Oscar's ability to play football in his Manchester United soccer kit. Other teams are available.
I think that, consumers are asking more and more and more about, they want to know where stuff comes from. And I just read an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal where a family cut out the processed food for a few months, and they found that they were less hungry, and that they figure they're going to continue to do that. Basically, they said, if the ingredients aren't something I have in my kitchen, then we don't eat that.
But also, steak raised regeneratively through Gabe's work can be different from steak raised.
Well, you can raise steak very regeneratively by grazing cattle on cover crops. And then if you graze the cattle on the right cover crops, then you don't have to use as much artificial fertilizers, which have runoff problems. It can be a real win-win situation.
How well do species work with each other on farm? Through Gabe's.
Well, you can have sheep and cattle. You can have sheep and cattle together. They work fine. They work just fine. And then there's Joe Saladin. He's done all kinds of stuff, integrating all kinds of things together. And it's amazing how much food he can grow off of a small amount of land. Takes a lot of labor. The homesteader people are getting real interested in those things. I've been to some of those meetings.
You mentioned grazing on cover crops. We recently had 3 loads of grass finishers. We grazed on covers. We averaged 4.05 pounds average daily gain on them. Hung them up at 4.05 pounds a day average daily gain, and hung up that group of heifers. They weighed just shy of 1,300 pounds live weight. So they were still plenty large enough as far as.
Well, they're plenty large enough. And what state was that we've been in? North Dakota. Yeah, I remember even like 5 years ago or so going to a grazing seminar there, and they were doing some really progressive things. And these are the kinds of things. I think one of the problems is that the beef and the crops have gotten so specialized, they don't want to mess with cattle. And then place where you had all this corn monoculture, none of the property was fenced. There were no perimeter fences. These are things that, getting the animals and the crops together. That's why I wrote the paper. All I did was just try to get all the decent studies I could find. And some of the things I learned from that is it takes time for the crop rotation to show an effect, like 3 to 5 years. Takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. That's a really important thing for people to know. But I've talked to people that are doing it. And I went to a ranch, about 4 years ago. And there was a pump jack there. It's a regular oil industry pump jack. You've seen hundreds of them. Well, this pump jack was pumping water. I had to go out and stand next to it. I had to commune with it. And I got to thinking, you could take that oil field technology, and maybe in the future we'll have to build some water pipelines. and we may have to shut them down in the winter because of freezing. But you could take the oil field technology, works for water, regular, ordinary pump check. You've seen hundreds of them. That really got me thinking. And the other thing, it's like I fly all the time and I get a window seat. I open the window. I can't see these dreary, dark airplanes. All the windows are closed. I open the window. And the thing that you notice, I do a lot of Denver to East Coast, Denver to New York, Denver to DC, Denver to Charlotte, those, and how the land changes as you go east. You go over, the plane takes off over eastern Colorado, no pivots. Then you see some pivots, and then you get halfway across. Then everything's green now. You really see the difference in the amount of water just flying over the land. And then you go over parts of Texas, and there's 5 pivots in the Panhandle, and 2 of them are shut off. I know the difference between small grains and shut off at 35,000 feet. It's amazing what you can see at 35,000 feet.
Yeah, and also the color of the water of the rivers, I notice when I'm flying. You see what's coming down the Mississippi and the Missouri and how brown and dirty they are. And you think about all the soil that's in that.
Oh, no, that's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And I'm old enough to remember really bad pollution in Boston Harbor when all the boat toilets flushed it. Oh, full thing. And then when I went to high school, Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Fitchburg Paper Company, this would have been early 60s, dumping all the paper mill waste right into the Nashville River. It was the most disgusting thing you ever saw. There was no rules. I'm old enough to remember that. Well, we can't go back to that kind of stuff.
One of the other things that I notice when I fly is, like, once the corn and soybeans are harvested in the Midwest, most do not plant a cover crop. And that's a missed opportunity to cycle carbon and to graze some livestock. They just don't do that. And to keep their soils healthier. You notice things like that.
Well, that's the thing. You see, it's sort of like mining. In some of the situations with aquifer, we're mining the water, and it's not getting replenished. I think we get in enough trouble, we'll be doing some of this stuff.
Gabe, from your vantage point, how can farmers practically integrate livestock and cover crops while confronting water limits and rebuilding soil at scale?
There's many, many benefits to integrating cover crops in a cash grain system. You're capturing more solar energy. You're taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere, through legumes, converting that into usable forms of N. You're feeding soil biology. You're holding the nutrients on the landscape. You're improving water infiltration, improving the water holding capacity of the soils. You're setting that next year's crop up with those nutrients. You can figure carbon nitrogen ratios of cover crops and the release of those nutrients. I go on and on. So many, many benefits. But then besides that, why would you not graze those cover crops with livestock? And I work with a lot of farmers who do not have a desire to graze livestock. And I tell them that's fine. But isn't there a young person in your community who would like that chance? Why not give them a chance? It'll benefit your soil tremendously, and you'll be helping out a young person in the community. Why won't you do that? Now, I'm going to disagree with Temple respectfully here a little bit, in that it really doesn't take as long as we once thought to advance soil health. We see significant changes in water infiltration and aggregation just with one growing season of diverse cover crops. So it can happen very quickly. Oh, one other real benefit of those fall seeded cover crops is you really inhibit those fall germinated weed seeds from occurring and affecting the next year's crop. All that adds up to more profit for the cash grain farmer. And then, as I said, helping a young person also.
Dr. Grandin, you focused on doing things to make the world a better place. I was curious, like, how important is Gabe's work to you? You know, his book, Dirt to Soil, your own paper.
I think all of these things are important. Gabe's done what Joe Saladin's done, putting information out there. One of the reasons why I had a big effect on cattle handling, I wrote about it. I wrote about it in books. I had a website up when websites hardly existed. And too many people hold on to their intellectual property too much. I just put it out there.
In your view, Dr. Grandin, what's the biggest missed opportunity in agriculture that could benefit from more visual-based way of thinking?
Well, I think all this crop rotation stuff, and visual thinkers have vision. See, what's happened with some of the getting in trouble with the heart problems, and people were just going with the numbers on the EPDs. Now, I'm not saying EPDs are bad, but there's still a place for visual appraisal. I remember about 10 years ago or so, talking to one of our top breeders. His cattle had awful hoof and foot conformation. He says, well, I just go by the numbers. He thought it was stupid. We're best buds now. He realized I was right. There's a place for visual appraisal to keep yourself out of trouble. Because his heart issues is an example of something that has slowly crept up.
Dr. Grandin, after all that's changed in the industry for animal welfare, what's the next frontier in your mind?
I'm just really concerned about some of the breeding. Just pushing the biology to the point where your animal starts to fall apart. Now that some of the chicken people, actually have corrected some of their problems. Because when I first started in chicken with McDonald's, it would have been 1997. Oh, the legs of the broilers, absolutely horrible. Now they've bred a big tree trunk of a leg. I mean, the broiler leg's about that big around. Bred a tree trunk of a leg on them. They've done some things to correct some of those problems. Then woody breasts got to be a problem in rapidly growing chickens. I think we have to look at what is optimal production. Optimal. That's a hard concept for people to get their head around. And I went to a crop seminar. This was in early January. Wasn't very busy. I went to our experiment station crop talks. And this professor, I don't remember the name, talking about corn. And he says the biggest corn isn't necessarily the best because it takes too many inputs. What is optimal size for the corn? Optimal. See, he's saying the same thing that, I've said about cattle. What is optimal, not maximal?
That's a great point. So often in production agriculture today, we're trying to outproduce our environment, and it's coming at the expense of the resource itself. And in the case you just described, the animal.
Oh, because you have an animal that dies a month before slaughter, that doesn't help your closeout. So what they've been doing is taking them to salvage slaughter, but that's really expensive to track them down, haul them off to a small plant. Because I can remember when this never happened. I mean, back, had a lot of problems with young cattle. There's still a lot of problems from very small producers, unvaccinated cattle, load them up on the semi. And right now, the price of cattle so high, they go, I'm going to just dump them off at the sale barn. No vaccinations, no preconditioning, no training them to eat out of feed troughs and drink out of water troughs. They just send them off. There's somebody else's problem when they die. That is still a huge problem because the market is segmented. We've got some politics in this country that's absolutely against passports for cattle. After mad cow hit Canada and in Europe, they got passports for cattle. You can trace them all the way back. We still don't have that. We didn't get quite enough mad cows to force that through.
Yeah. What's it going to take to get that?
Some other big mess. Bernie Rowan used to call a breakthrough event where something happens enough to force it through. I can remember some animal welfare stuff, horrendous videos about 20 years ago, knocking dairy cows over with a forklift. I mean, really bad stuff. And one government official goes, that video was a policy-changing event.
Yeah, because suddenly it ties it to money, right? And that's kind of bringing it back. What about the use of cages and crates in the poultry? And
let's differentiate between broilers and layers. Broilers so far have never been in cages. They're just put in on litter. I think sow stalls need to go away. We need to be getting a decent large-scale commercial. They'll still be indoors. They'll still be on slats, but they'll have the freedom to walk around. And you also have to get the right genetics that isn't going to fight. Because if you have a sow live in a box, she's not going to fight. So back in the 80s, when they just bred for rapid gain, a giant loin eye, and thin back fat, they accidentally, nobody would do this on purpose, actually bent a really nasty pig that really fights and bites. Really nasty pig. And those will not work in group housing. You've got to breed a gentler pig. People have done that. So some of what's called California, proposition pigs, they're still living in on slats, but they're totally loose. And the sows are very gentle. I've been in some of those systems and they were working just fine. That's what I'm going to call a decent large-scale commercial. But it's still indoors, just on slats. But the animals can walk around. And there's a very nice farrowing stall that you can get where you close her in for the first 4 days when the pigs are very fragile. And then the sides open up like this. And then the sow's free to turn around. You only lock her in the first few days when the pigs are really small and fragile. But we also have some issues where we're pushing that sow to have more and more piglets. And she can't feed all those piglets. See, there's a point where you've gone too far with that.
Yep, trying to outproduce the environment. That's right.
Yeah, that's the problem. That gets back to what the crop scientist said. That's one of our crop scientists. What's optimal, not maximum. The tallest corn is not necessarily the best thing.
So how about this, Dr. Grandin, if I could ask, you have conventional cattle with antibiotics and hormones, which still make up a large proportion of the industry.
Well, we've got to cut back on the antibiotic use. Yeah, because that's, you want your hair to fall out at night. Look up on pigs, manure, antibiotics, manure, and pigs. 3 keywords. You'll find papers you'll lay awake at night, because what's the problem with the antibiotic feeding? It's not eating the meat. That's not an issue. The meat's fine. They test it for residues. But these pigs are excreting huge amounts of antibiotics onto the soil. And antibiotics came from the soil. And weird stuff's going on in the soil. Crap on dirt. It's where you're going to have to worry. I think there's been problems in India where they manufacture drugs, them dumping the antibiotics out in the river and getting antibiotic resistance right around this factory where they were making antibiotics. Now, we're going to have to cut down on the antibiotic feeding. Hormones, in Europe and a lot of countries, they just feed bulls. And then we cut the hormones off. But I haven't found anything to show that ear implants are dangerous. That doesn't affect the meat. That, it affects then there was the issue 15 years ago, very powerful beta agonists, making cattle stiff and lame. Yeah, I took a lot of pushback on that one. And the problem is no safety issue. It's how it affects the animal. And again, it's pushing the biology too hard.
But what about the meat? Does it?
You feed antibiotics, they test for antibiotics. And there's no problem with eating the meat.
Gabe, how do you see producers balancing data observation and the push for optimal, not maximal production in regenerative systems?
I'll never forget back in 2009, I was harvesting a corn crop. I was sitting in the combine and I was talking to my son, Paul, who was away at the university. And I was complaining a little bit about the yield of that corn crop. And he said, Dad, think about it. you're trying to outproduce our environment. Man, that hit me alongside the head. And I'm like, you know what? He's right. Here I am in a semi-brittle environment. We get about 10 to 12 inches of rainfall and another 4 or 5 inches of moisture from snow each year. I can't expect to grow 150 or 60 bushel corn every year on that. Wherever you're at, there's only so much moisture. There's only so much sunshine each year, right? You can only cycle so much nutrients. I'm in an environment, we only have approximately 120 frost-free days every year. Biology can only cycle so much nutrients in that time. If I'm trying to feed it copious amounts of nutrients, I'm actually burning through the carbon in my soils. So you have to work within the context of your environment. And ever since that conversation, I have never really cared what my yields are any given year. Why? Because they're going to be profitable ones because I'm working within the context of my environment.
I've got a couple of questions from people who have written in. One's from Claire Whittle, who's a vet in the UK, and she asked, what are your top 3 tips to think about when moving cattle, especially when moving long distances?
Okay, the first thing, let's calm down when we move cattle. If you get cattle all scared and excited, it takes 20 minutes to calm down. Same thing for a cat. Let's say you go to the vet and the cat turns into a fur ball. It's going to take maybe half an hour for that cat to calm down. Well, the first thing is don't get them all excited. That's the first thing. And move them slowly. They're going to want to do a little grazing along the way. Another tip is move at the rate of the slowest animal.
The reason that I was really keen to set this whole conversation up was to look at the time between animal welfare and regenerative agriculture. And I've seen enough studies now to know that consumers in your typical supermarket across the world, particularly in the protein space, the meat space, definitely care about animal welfare when they're making their purchasing decisions, but they're still maybe not quite sure what regenerative agriculture is and how it affects the meat and how meat's connected to soil, all of those issues. I was just curious to hear your view on the time between animal welfare and regenerative agriculture.
I love that question, Rich. I think they go hand in hand. You know, my son Paul has a saying, our animals have one great life, one bad moment. And you think about that. They do. Our animals are out grazing their entire life. They're not in confinement, except during the winter, our hens are in a hoop house. It's a little tough to have free range hens in the middle of winter in North Dakota. But our hens are free range. Our dogs, even our guard dogs, are free range. Our sheep are moved daily. Our cattle are moved daily during the growing season. Our hogs are out on pasture. I tell other producers that if you think that animal needs to be in confinement, go open the gate or open the door and see where they'd rather be. I bet you they'd rather be out grazing. That's what they evolved to do. Or in the case of a pig, rooting around, or in the case of a chicken, finding insects to eat. I think it's harmony with nature. We have this symbiotic relationship, and then you start looking at all the birds and the insects and the wildlife that are living in harmony with the animals, our domesticated livestock. I think it's a good life and a good ecosystem.
Yeah. And I often think about the sounds when I visited your ranch, which I was lucky enough to do last year, and go to regenerative ranches compared to more conventionally ranches. If you just switch everything off around you and just listen, you can kind of hear the life. But I think that's a stark reminder of all of the other things that you're affecting through regenerative agriculture.
When I went through my years of hail and drought, I had stopped tilling and then the hailstorms came, but the one thing I noticed is each year I got more life on the ranch. And that's when it occurred to me, man, it's a lot more fun. We're working with life than death. The old saying, build it and they will come. Well, the earthworms came and the insects came and the birds came and the raptors came and all the wildlife came, and it was like, wow, the whole place is coming back to life.
Yeah, that's amazing. But I think the message is clear. If as a consumer listening to this, you care about animal welfare and that's why you choose your certain type of meat that you choose, then you should care about regenerative agriculture and soil.
Well, that's exactly right. Go near a feedlot, if they let you near one, and count how many birds you see. Maybe a few pigeons and some sparrows. Well, we just had a bird count done on our ranch, and in one day they documented 105 different species of birds. Think of the difference there. Think of that difference. And that's dictated by the consumers who purchase our products. You know, they're saying they want more of that. And that's a good thing.
So Dr. Grandin, another question. This is from a friend called Salah Shemarani, and he says there's much debate about the role of livestock in our society and that we should take a different look at them and less as food. What's your stance on that, and how do you encourage the public to think about the role of livestock and its husbandry?
What do we do with the 20% of the land that can only be grazed? Do we not raise food on that land? You're going to need grazing animals. Now, I left bison out of my paper. I do have one bison reference that a reviewer gave me. I need to thank the reviewer for that. I have no idea who the reviewer is. But he said before Europeans came to North America, the herds of bison put out about 85% as much methane as the cattle put out now. Let's just put it in perspective. Thank that reviewer. And that reference is in that paper. But what do we do with the land? And the grazing animals, if you do them right, they improve the land. The land evolved to be grazed. And what's going to happen if you don't graze it? The woody shrubs are going to take over it. You want to talk about a fire hazard? That's going to be fire getting.
Well, that's one of the issues in California. They've removed the animals, and now you have that buildup of the fuel, the shrubs, and wildfires take.
Well, and then we lost 1,000 houses in Denver. And right across the field, there was this field, they just let it go wild. Then over in Hawaii, where that town burned up, I went to Hawaii shortly after that. I didn't go to that town, but I saw this horrible tall grass, horrible tall grass, dried, dead tall grass. And that was on an abandoned sugarcane field. Nobody's brought up that maybe that should have been great.
And ironically, Dr. Grandin, I was over in Hawaii in 2016, and I met with the Department of Agriculture, and I met with the sugar industry. I won't name the names. And they were talking at that time of transitioning out of sugar. And I specifically talked to them that you need to have grazing animals on the land or you will have issues. Well, they found out.
Well, we had issues. The town was burned up. And as soon as I found out about the grass and I found out what the species was, I looked it up and found out it was edible for cattle. And that should have been grazed. And the land that was responsible for fire burning up 1,000 houses, that should have been grazed. The animals are part of the ecosystem, especially in the arid areas. What do we do with eastern Colorado? There's like 100-mile stretch. What do? Not raise food on that? What do you do with the sand hills of Nebraska? The Flint Hills of Kansas. You can see when they cut through the road, you've got this much soil, and that's rocks.
But the other thing, as you said, and we've proven it in our work with regenerative agriculture, I work with a lot of cropland farmers that do not have livestock, and I tell them we can improve the health of your soil, but it will never be as good as it could be if you don't integrate livestock. You said it. Livestock take it to another level.
That's right. And we need to look into these fencing laws. Because after I was driving by all this monoculture, I put the name of the state in and fencing laws. And I was not pleased with what I read. And you could lose the farm if there was a bad accident and get the crap sued out of you. Somebody gets super badly injured and they don't recover, and then they just sue the crap out of the farm. Where Texas I've been down to Texas, they got feeder cattle on stalks, one little tiny wire. And for the most part, they don't get out.
It's a matter of proper animal handling and training them,
These are things that we need to be doing. And the other thing that the people that are doing this need to write about how to do it. I don't know how many articles I wrote about just on how to handle cattle, how to design corrals. And I'm finding now we got a new generation coming in. I got to go back and really do baby basics. Some people that are super good at some of the Bud Williams stuff, so well, Temple just talks about beginner stuff. Well, most of the people need the beginner stuff. And if I can just get them to do some of that, well, simple stuff like, okay, we got an animal in a single file chute, going in a squeeze chute, and people stand at the head with a paddle and poke its butt. You're telling it to go forward and back at the same time. You still have to teach people that basic stuff. And I'm doing my cattle handling class, and we do basics. And right now we got 80 students in the class, and I'm going to guess that 60, 70% of them have no experience with animals. Now, when I first started 35 years ago, I'd have a lot of ranch students in my class. I'll have a few of those. But we have a lot of students that are pre-vet, and they have no background with animals, with livestock. Well, I have to teach basics. That's what you got to do.
I've made this statement before, Dr. Grandin, and I want to see if you agree with me. But I really believe the next generation of leaders in agriculture will not have been born or raised on a farm or ranch.
Yeah, and that's true. But then I was not. I wasn't raised on a farm. I came from back east. Then I went up to my aunt's ranch when I was 15, and I decided the West was where I wanted to be. No, I agree with you on that. They won't be born on a farm. And what's happening is some of the farms around Washington, D.C., I was there a couple of years ago, just outside of D.C. You go out and there's pasture land and stuff. And the kids don't want to be on the farm. That's one of the problems.
Yeah. And for your information, neither was I. I was not born or raised on a farm either.
Dr. Grandin, thinking about the diet of humans and animals, I'm curious if we should be advocating for going back to a more kind of natural evolutionary state of diet. Should cattle be eating so much corn and soy, or should they be eating more grass? And
well, maybe the thing to do. See, and the beef on dairy is going to be a big problem. What are we going to do with those? They, keep them on grass a heavier weight. You see, one of the reasons why they feed so much grain, and I never will forget, back in the 70s, Bart Carden, when I was writing for the magazine, I covered the Arizona Cattle Feeders Day. He said, grain's the cheapest gain. That's why they feed it. I never forgot that. It's that simple. But as we're getting young people, this homesteader movement, there's a lot of interest in that. And I've been invited to quite a few of those meetings. And those people, some of those get out and do things. The other thing is you need to be looking at more as a whole fire mitigation thing. I mean, I was just shocked when I went over to Hawaii and I saw that grass, and I'm going, they had 3-foot high dead grass like that on abandoned sugarcane fields right next to the town. God, I would have taken a whole bunch of loads of cattle and just let them have at it. Maybe that fire wouldn't have happened. And the thing that's weird is nobody has brought that up about Hawaii, the land not being grazed. Now, the land in Denver, yes, people have brought up about that. But the Hawaii, I didn't hear anything in the news media about maybe that land should have been grazed.
And they could be producing their own food there.
Yeah. One of the problems you got with Hawaii is horribly bureaucratic. It's very difficult to get things done there. I went there, I gave a talk at a farm meeting that was, vacation place. That's why they were there. But then I went to an abandoned derelict experiment station where the jungle had started to take it over. It was weird. Old abandoned dairy. I found like 1960s dairy magazines and a knife, and the ones that weren't dirty, I gave them to the students. But the thing is, it was kind of tied up in so much bureaucracy. I couldn't, it's hard to do stuff there. I don't really know why, but it just seems to be a real problem.
Because Dr. Grandin, one question which we got from a friend called Anne Mallow, she said, after a life of pushing change forward, which way works best? Regulations, third-party programs, or customer demand? I was wondering if you could talk on that.
A combination of things. But let's take pollution. Because I remember the days when the power plant belched black smoke. I was 7 years old, and I asked if it was going to dirty up the air. Everybody thought it would just disappear, but I remember in fourth grade class, teachers held up an apple and said, well, if Earth's an apple, the atmosphere is the skin. And then I saw that power plant that I saw when I was 7. Yeah, that's going to dirty up the atmosphere. It did. And horrible polluted river paper mill. And disgusting Boston Harbor. Every boat toilet flushed into Boston Harbor. It was beyond revolting. I'm old enough to remember that. See, a lot of people now argue about this stuff. They're not as old as I'm 78 years old. I remember. I think we need. My proposed regulation is fewer, more strict regulation.
Yeah, and that's regulation. That's regulation, right?
And the other thing is my McDonald's thing. I saw more improvement in the slaughter plants when I did those McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's audits than I've seen in my whole career. So that was customer demand. The big buyers, pushing that. And that's where I spend most of my time now, rather than regulation. But you have to have there gets to be too much regulation, and then the animal welfare officer just spends all their time on paperwork and no time on actually how do we fix things. You see, and the things that made the slaughter plants easy to fix is 80% of it was management and simple fixes like some non-slip flooring, repairs. Oh, stunning, captive bolt stunning, maintenance. I can't say that word enough. As far as captive bolt stunners go, they take a lot of maintenance every single day. And if you don't do that maintenance, it loses the hitting power, and it's not good.
Dr. Grandin, how about the human diet? Do you still eat Jell-O and yogurt like was portrayed in the movie?
No, I don't. The reason I ate Jell-O and yogurt I eat. The reason I was eating yogurt and Jell-O in the movie is I had horrendous colitis, and everything went through me. And what actually stopped the colitis was antidepressant medication. I discussed it in my old autobiography, Thinking Pictures. I've been on low dose, old-fashioned antidepressant medication, starter dose, ever since my early 30s. And when I went on that med, the colitis cleared up.
What's your favorite food now? If you go out for a treat for a restaurant, what do you like to order?
Well, I like steak. I also like to order salmon.
And what about your shopping experience when you go to buy food from the grocery store? What are the kind of things that maybe you could advise our listeners to look out for, especially in the meat sector?
All right, now, if you're on a low income, you're going to be buying chicken. If you're on low income, I'll tell you that. It's like a third the cost of the other stuff. And the chicken is basically just grown on grain and soy, and hormones are not used in chicken. There's no hormones given to chicken. Antibiotics, sometimes fed antibiotics, but not hormones. They've never had hormones for worse.
I would also advise the listeners, there's cuts of beef that are relatively inexpensive, yet tremendously nutrient dense. Some of the organ meats, my favorite cut is shank because I get the bone marrow with it. And made correctly, it'll rival any ribeye steak out there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. It's a huge honor to have you and to hear your thoughts on everything.
It was an absolute pleasure seeing you again, Dr. Grandin.
Well, okay, it's been super, super good to talk to you.
Very good stuff there with Gabe and Dr. Temple Grandin, and I so much appreciate, again, Richard and Claire from the 6 Inches of Soil podcast being willing to share this content with us and with our audience. And kind of for both of you, Richard, what were some of your key thoughts or takeaways from that conversation?
Well, obviously, I was delighted to have confirmed that she's a big fan of regenerative agriculture. And that was what my hope was going into the interview. So that was great that she's a big fan of integration of livestock. You know, when she sees corn that's been harvested and there are no cattle grazing on that, I love that she called that out. And that obviously affects large acreage in the state. So that was awesome that she pointed that out. I loved her it was only a tiny little comparison, but when she spoke about how she pictures the Earth's atmosphere as being like the skin on an apple, and how she saw these black industrial smoke going up into the air and how thin and fragile that atmosphere is. I thought that was really cool. I loved her thoughts about trying to make this more accessible for kids and children, and how that education of getting out into the soil is something that she is a big proponent of. So that was great. And then just the general affordability of food, and how she talked about how do people on minimum wage afford this stuff. And I know that with time this is going to work, because the cost of production is lower from these systems, and sometimes the shelf price is still higher for regenerative food. But I think that's more down to supply and demand. And once we get more supply to meet that demand, it will provide affordable, nutrient-dense food. But yeah, I just thought it was really fascinating to get her take on things, and just such a treat to talk to somebody that personally I've looked up to for so many years. But what about you, Claire? What were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I was enthralled because, having seen the documentary, to actually have her there in person, and I loved how she talked about the history, how she was doing this so long. You know, these 50 years of learning is very unique in this space. So I think it's really amazing how she reflects, but she's also very current, and she brought up latest pieces she's read, and how she's every day, even at 78, thinking about the world and her position in it, and the way she's so perceptive when she's talking about animals, and, you know, us, we're all animals, but she just using her sort of different senses that some of us, and different perspectives, visual perspectives. I just loved all that description.
So what about you, Clay? What did you think of the episode?
You know, one of the things that really stuck out to me was a statement that Temple made about seeing the shrinking of agricultural interest in continuing agricultural education. So like she said, the majority of her kids now come from non-farming backgrounds. The majority of the students coming through her classes come from non-farming backgrounds. And that was pretty surprising to me. And I wonder if the two conversations are connected, right? Like if we up overall farm and ranch profitability, would we get more interest in that continuing education? And I just think those two conversations are connected. And then also appreciated you involving your kids. That was great perspective to get, and they did a great job. So shout out to them.
Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, I have a job keeping them off the microphone. If I'm making the podcast, or if I tell them something's happening, then they can't stay away. But yeah, it is quite nice to get that point of view of little people's voices on. And to your point, I think you're exactly right. As farmers start to get into more regenerative practices, I do see younger people start to get interested. And I've spoken to many farmers who that is true. Like their kids have no interest in coming back onto the farm, but as they start to get into more of these regenerative practices and maybe wildlife starts to return, it becomes a much more interesting place to work. So I think you're right, it is interlinked. And yeah, I would just like to add that we're really grateful for you including us.
I really appreciate you guys sharing the conversation. It was a great conversation, very unique perspective that I don't think can be had very often. And so I'm really honored to release it here. And again, one more time, send people your direction. 6 Inches of Soil podcast sounds like a great format that you have there as well, and really appreciate it. So everybody, will be back again soon with another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
Thanks, mate.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.